making notes in a personal diary. They were memories of that danger. From a year when he was confined to a hospital bed. Yet he mentioned he always was well, healthy, alive, aware and awake, just in another time, in the year 3906 and in the body of from someone else. He described things that we only understand today as holograms, the internet and cryogenics, for example. It also narrated events that occurred on Earth, such as a world government, and beyond the planet, like the colonization of Mars. He mentioned various wars and catastrophes with precise exact dates, and with the names of great leaders who have not even been born yet, and also revealed details about amazing evolution of humanity. Hello, history friends. This is the story of our journey into the future. Written by Swiss-Austrian Paul Amadeus Diener, goes far beyond the famous flying cars. It even states that in over 2,000 years, the inhabitants of our world will no longer be human, and they change to another color. But first, let's go back to the past to tell how this story began. It was the 1920s, a terrible disease. Do you see called sleepy sickness? It affected over 1 million people around the world. The world was also known as the sleeping sickness, and here on the channel there is a video explaining about it. Just click up there. Check. People with this illness had difficulty speaking, moving, to stay awake, and during that time it was like an epidemic. Lethargic encephalitis. Professor Paul Diener began to show these symptoms, and the first time he came to spend 15 million minutes completely out of touch, as if he was sleeping. Until one day, in 921, in Geneva, he passed out again and fell into a coma, this time for a whole year. From then on begins the story of Paul Diener, who remembered feeling sick and later waking up in some sort of bed in a strange place surrounded by very different people speaking an unknown language that vaguely resembled English mixed with Nordic languages, and sometimes German as well. Me too, as he was a teacher of that. They used the mannequin. He introduced himself, said his own name, the profession, where he came from and why. Asked where it was, but nobody understood each other from until he mentioned Switzerland, when those strangers seemed to react. Medical team members who could understand a bit better and spoke somewhat incorrect German told the patient he might be suffering from a type of post-traumatic stress disorder, because his name was not Paul Diener. His name was actually Andreas Norton, a famous scientist who had an accident and was clinically dead for a while. Minutes. When the doctors lowered his brain temperature, they managed to restart his heart. But Diener replied that he had no idea who this Andreas Norton was, and that he was not famous, he was a nice guy. Just a simple language teacher, and did not know what was happening. Things got worse when he managed to look at himself in a mirrored surface and saw a strange face reflected in its place. What should have been his face, and started to panic. Desperation. He was even more shocked when he was informed that he was in the year 3906. And he couldn't believe it, but looking out the window, he saw a world drastically different from the one he knew. Buildings so tall they pierced the clouds. Some seemed to be made with crystal walls, and he saw objects made of a shiny metal and vehicles that defied gravity. Speeding through. From the air outside, it was too much for Paul Diener's head, and he began to think he had died, was dead. Dead? It could only be that, or even worse. Into madness. Not stopping crying and screaming, he eventually passed out and was closely watched for 3 days, until being taken later to meet the members of a kind of council formed by older and wiser people, and explain to the teacher some concepts that even today, the day would still let anyone in. Quite a few of us confused. The first was about the trip to the future. The wise one said that time, it's not linear, that the consciousness of everyone exists all the time, everywhere. They were knowledgeable. Rare phenomenon, the change of consciousness, where someone's mind or soul could be moved to the body by someone else, and it was what they thought had happened with Paul Diener. Therefore, they instructed the teacher to take on the life of Andreas Norton, who was the true owner of that body, the future, and also summoned the best Andres' friend named Estefan to follow Podina every day and explain to the stranger. The man from the past, how that modern society worked and thus tried to reverse the change, recover the consciousness of the scientific friend, and send it back from the teacher to the body itself. In a coma, Paul Dina spent a lot of time exploding,
studying a new language,
and learning to use a technology he described as a portable device with moving three-dimensional images that glow in the mirror. Dark, he read a lot, always, and got tired without ever being able to sleep. Paul Dina was encouraged by doctors to find out everything you wanted to know about the past. Let's start in the 21st century. Because they were afraid that, returning to the year 1922, the professor might know about any historical event that could happen. Or, SEO. I heard about the 2,300 years ago were the most difficult for the human race, with overpopulation in many countries, regional conflicts. In 2024, finally we colonized Mars, and in 60 years the Martian population reached 20,000. Millions of people, but in 2265 they were all decimated in a planetary catastrophe, something like a massive impact that destroyed everything. In 2309, there was a nuclear war of a medium-scale event that devastated most of Europe, where only the Baltic countries and the Scandinavians survived, and that war was global. It lasted 80 years old, with most of the population being exterminated. In the year 2396, a new world government was established to end wars, wrapping up the old call, a period in history marking the beginning of modern history. Modern times. It turns out that this government, always led by the rich and powerful, was also very corrupt. And for 200 years it faced the resistance of various countries where local nationalism was still very strong. Strong until the citizens stopped electing politicians and businessmen. The highest positions were occupied by scientists, philosophers, humanitarian issues, and in the following 300 years, society began to reform. In 2800, in 1923, a world leader named Thorhild proposed a new economic system no longer based on scarcity, but rather in global adequacy, and people began to turn towards the good of the world, greater, in order to meet everyone's material needs. Over time, technology and automation had advanced so much that by the time Paul Dina arrived in the future, people only needed to work 2 years in their field of choice and could only continue in that career if they wanted, leading the life they wished. After that, money as we know it was no longer used and value was placed in things like art and so on. By the year 3906, there were hardly any laws left, and selfishness was studied as a concept. Archaic sketch from a less evolved species. With so much free time, free from the chains of debts to pay and labor obligations, people began to dedicate themselves to the expansion of their own consciousness and evolving spiritually. Finally, in the year 3906, Paul Dina says we will no longer be human. He discovered that in the future, the human brain structure evolved into a new sensory organ developing, and that gave people the ability to perceive a new plane of existence, another dimension with access to a vast spiritual knowledge. It was a new cognitive ability that gave people feelings of incredible happiness and spiritual peace. A divine joy was around the year 30 that a phenomenon began to occur with people, an instant spiritual enlightenment, so powerful that in the beginning everyone died, until on the 6th of September 3382, a 16-year-old man passed away. 76 years old, named Alexis Volk, was struck with this state of ecstasy but survived. And from then on, everyone began having this experience without dying, with this change in human nature itself in the future. In the future, Homo sapiens, that is, the man who knows, is the Homo sapiens sapiens, the man. De quando esse who knows gave rise to another human species, de Homo occidentalis novus. The new man, the citizen. accidental. Future humans are already aware of the existence of other intelligent beings who live in the solar system and around the galaxy. And these extraterrestrial beings also experience their body, their own kind of lighting. And Paul Dina finally managed to go back in time because of that. From such an experience, Sonny shows an instant spiritual enlightenment. That happened when he understood that Sylvia, a woman he was involved with in the future, was the reincarnation of a young woman because ono po si Tuktao. He was in love in the village where he lived over 2,000 years ago. On that day, the body of the scientist Andres Norton managed to sleep for the first time in a year, and the awareness of Paul Gina returned to his own body. But in the year 1922, when he woke up, then in 1924, in that year, he was already living in Greece, and before returning to his homeland, delivered hundreds of pages with notes to his best German student, Georgius Paparazzi, without explaining what it was about, but for him to translate the text as an exercise. The two said goodbye and never saw each other again, and that's how that student, who would later become respected professor of administrative law, discovered that the manuscript was the personal diary of Paul Dina, with an amazing story about time travel, and that was published decades later. A more recent version is by another Greek author, Achilles Syria, based on the same diary and called Chronicles of the Future. We know that setting a date like this
as far away
the
as
year
3,000 to
1930
6,000.
incapable to confirm or refute these notes, while leaving us free to speculate whether the diary is indeed the result of memories. Today I am
impressions of
How so? Or a
a
work of
very
art?
interesting science fiction created by paparazzi. We don't even know if it could exist. The picture shown all over the internet as